Welcome back. Every time a law enforcement officer goes to work, there's a risk that they won't come home alive. It's just not a guarantee. Over the past several years, the names of Connecticut officers who have died on the job have been added to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C. Thankfully, there were no line of duty deaths in 2025 of Connecticut local or state police officers. A new report released earlier this month shows that the numbers nationally are down. Bill Alexander is the CEO of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. He joins me now via Zoom. Bill, good morning. Thank you for being with us. And I guess, one is too many, but when you have the numbers in aggregate, knowing that police officers will lose their lives on the job, unfortunately, it must be somewhat good news to see that the numbers are at what I believe are historic lows, right?
Yes, Eric. Well, first, thank you for having me on to help tell the story. And I completely understand the sentiment of what you just said, but we, of course, never like to use the words good news when we're talking about even a single police officer's death. And I know that's not the way you mean it. But with the words I use generally are a positive trend. What we were reporting for 2025 is a really significant positive trend for law enforcement. It's a very, very low number. We're reporting 111 line of duty deaths for the year 2025. And the reason it's even more important is because 14 of those deaths are related to the response and recovery efforts following the terror attacks on 9/11. And so 14 of those deaths are men and women who, by breathing in the toxins there in the local atmosphere in and around New York, obtained illnesses, most specifically cancers, that shorten their lives to some degree. And I'm not in any way minimizing those 14 deaths, but it does allow us, if we take away those 14 deaths, to look at the circumstances and the sort of causal effects in 2025 that led to an officer's death. That number then is 97, and it's below 100, which below 100 is a very significant catchphrase in the law enforcement community. It's something everybody in law enforcement has been working towards for decades. The number of deaths has not been below 100 since the 1940s. And so, again, if you take away those 14 deaths and just look at causal impacts, something that happened in 2025 that caused a death, we are below 100 for the first time in decades, and it's a really, really significant milestone.
Yeah, I look back at the numbers, 1943, 94 line of duty deaths. So that's how long back we're looking here to get to that below 100 number. I want to talk about some of the folks who did lose their lives, but what do you make of that, as you call it, a positive trend? Is there anything we can point to say this is why, or is it just that the numbers change year to year?
I think that there are a number of factors. I really wish that I could double click on one specific thing and say, hey, this is the answer, and we need to double and triple down on that in the years ahead to save even more lives. But there are a couple things that are sort of in the soup that I think are influencing the outcomes here. One, ballistic resistant vest manufacturers and the associated technology around that. More and more officers are wearing vests because they're more malleable, they're more comfortable, they're thinner, they're lighter. Departments all across the country are mandating that officers wear bullet-resistant vests. I think that is helping to keep the number down. Officers all across the country have begun over the last decade to receive even more advanced medical care. The department I retired from, we called it tactical emergency care. And every single officer was issued something called a tactical emergency care kit, which included things like a tourniquet and some stop blood loss material, pretty advanced stuff. It's not just first aid and, say, putting on a Band-Aid, some really advanced medical techniques. And I think by virtue of, in many cases, an officer being significantly hurt, say shot or in some sort of car accident, more likely than not, the first person to be on the scene to assist them is going to be another police officer. And by virtue of this medical training, I'm convinced that police officers are helping to save other police lives. There are a whole host of people in and around the law enforcement community who, for decades, have been thinking about nonstop, how can we make police work safer? Not just for men and women in uniform, also men and women on the other side of the law enforcement equation, but certainly for men and women in uniform who every single year historically have died in and around the range of 150 per year. So how can we reduce that number again, get it below 100, or hopefully one day zero? And so all of those sort of training protocols and best practices, all of us in this field trying to come up with new ways and new training mechanisms to keep our officers safe. I hope to some degree our work in that arena and the work of others is helping to pay dividends there and is reflective of the number. And finally, I would say we as an organization are completely apolitical. I don't mean this in any way political, but over the last 5 years specifically, I feel pretty strongly that lots of the rhetoric, the tone, the tenor of the conversation around law enforcement had been largely negative, maybe even from a worrying degree too many of the mouths of our elected officials. And I know that doesn't mean that officers can't or don't make mistakes, and it doesn't mean that people aren't entitled to have an opinion about how and when officers are out there using force, say. But I think that tone and rhetoric really, what I might describe as, demonized the profession to such a degree that to some variable that was influencing some of the behaviors by people in the public on the margins interacting with law enforcement. And I think over the last year, some of that tone and tenor has changed for what I might be the better. And again, I'm not putting my thumb on the political scale here. I don't care who the administration is. I'm just recognizing that talk about police and agencies and officers has improved. And I think on the margins, that might be influencing some of those behaviors. So collectively, I think all 3 or 4 of those major factors are helping to drive the number down.
Give us a couple of the important stats that come out of this report. I know that firearm deaths are down, but still the leading cause. Motor vehicle accidents, also a top cause. And then I was interested to see the average age was 44 with 14 years of service. So, to the extent that, we're talking about someone making a mistake, maybe a motor vehicle collision because of an officer mistake, something like that. By and large, these are an experienced group of officers, unfortunately, who have lost their lives.
Yes, so the top level takeaways are 44 men and women died by firearms. Of course, that means someone on the opposing side had a weapon, which they then pointed at and shot towards a police officer, ultimately killing them. Of course, there's another word for that, murder. So 44 police officers were murdered by firearms. 34 men and women died in some sort of traffic-related fatality. Some of those are men and women outside of their cars, perhaps doing a traffic stop or directing traffic. Some of those traffic deaths are the officers themselves inside their own cruiser. And then we have 33, which we put in what we call the other category, which is mostly medical related deaths, say heart attacks as they're affecting an arrest. But there are a good handful of deaths in there that are also noteworthy. Say someone was crushed to death, there was an aircraft crash, one officer drowned, one officer was stabbed, and so forth. So, and again, those that I mentioned at the top, the 14 9/11 related deaths, where those officers succumbed to injuries that they really obtained many, many years ago. That was 14. So those are the 3 high-level takeaways. And all of those numbers are down year over year. So firearms fatalities, traffic fatalities, and all 3 of those subcategories are down significantly year over year.
A lot of positive trends in that report.